He came in barefoot, dirty, and with eyes full of sadness. People laughed. But when he took the microphone, no one imagined that he would reveal the secret that would change the lives of everyone in that room. Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful that it made you rethink everything about life? It happened at a wedding where everything was going well, until a stranger, a man no one knew, completely changed the course of the celebration. This is the kind of story you'll never forget. That night, another celebration of love was set to take place. It was a simple wedding, but full of meaning. The kind of party you imagine to be perfect. The setting was decorated with fresh flowers. The guests gathered happily around the tables, and the bride, radiant, seemed to be the star of the evening. What could possibly go wrong? The day was unfolding like any other typical wedding. Until suddenly, something unusual happened, something that made everyone's heart beat faster and the air tense. He appeared like a shadow in the bright light of the event. No one knew exactly where he came from, but his presence was immediately noticed. With dirty clothes, a tired countenance, and clumsy steps, the man seemed lost. He wasn't in the right place. What was he doing there? There was no obvious explanation, and no one recognized him. He wasn't a guest, he wasn't on the list, and he seemed to have slipped in without anyone noticing. At an event where everything was supposed to be perfect, he was the exception. Glances began to cross. As if he were a single unit, everyone looked at him suspiciously, not knowing exactly how to react. The murmuring began quietly, but soon grew, and the feeling of discomfort became apparent. He didn't seem to be there by chance. He was, in many ways, the antithesis of what everyone was celebrating at that moment. The wedding was about love, togetherness, and building a future, while he seemed to carry with him the burdens of abandonment, loneliness, and the pain of a past that no one knew how to face. But there was something peculiar about the way he walked, the way he behaved. He wasn't just any man lost at an event. He seemed to have a reason for being there, even if no one knew what it was. As the people around him moved away, trying not to show their judgment, he walked to the center of the room, where the main table was, and asked for something that seemed absurdly out of place. He asked for the microphone. This was the first time he had spoken. There was no simple request or look at me. No, he just asked for the microphone. As if it was something he had done before, with a calm, almost supernatural confidence. The silence in the room was instantaneous. All eyes were on him. The feeling of discomfort was at its limit, and no one knew how to react. The groom looked uncomfortably at the bride. She, who until then had been full of smiles and sweet words, was now visibly tense. She had never imagined that her special day would be interrupted by an unknown man, let alone someone who looked like that. Doubt began to hang over everyone. What would he do? What did he want? Some thought he was there to do something inappropriate, perhaps to ask for money or disrupt the event in some way. But what no one knew, what no one could have predicted, was that this man was not as much of a threat as everyone had imagined. He was about to teach a lesson about life that none of those present would ever forget. But before anyone could react, the man already had the microphone in his hands, and the whole room was silent. What he said next, at that moment, was the turning point. He began with a simple, "I need a minute." The phrase was not what people expected. No fuss, no drama. Just a simple sentence, but one that carried within it the weight of a much deeper story. 1 minute. Just a minute. He was asking for something that seemed so small in the face of the magnitude of everything that was happening at that moment. But at the same time, that minute seemed to be the key that would unlock the doors to a reality that no one was prepared to see. The discomfort on the bride and groom's faces was visible. The bride, who was surrounded by friends and family who admired her, began to feel uneasy. What was happening there? How was this happening on the day she was supposed to be the center of attention? She tried to disguise it, but the anxiety was clear on her face. The groom, for his part, looked at the man skeptically, trying to understand what this human being, apparently with no connection to them or the party, wanted. Everyone else was equally divided between curiosity and the need to maintain the image of perfection that the day represented. But there was one thing the man did immediately, and it made everyone feel even more tense. He looked directly at the bride. It wasn't an uncomfortable look or an ordinary expression. It was a look that, for an instant, seemed to penetrate directly into his soul, as if he knew something about her that no one else did, as if he had seen something inside her that no one else could. He wasn't there to steal the show, he wasn't there to put on a show. He was there because there was something he needed to share. He wasn't a threat, but to the others, he still seemed like a stranger. A figure out of context, someone no one understood, who no one knew where he came from or what he was doing there. However, what he had to say would change everything. At this point, the problem was no longer about what the man was doing there. The challenge was no longer the dirty clothes or the suspicious looks from the guests. The real problem was the room's resistance to accepting the man's vulnerability and humanity. They were all so caught up in the idea of a perfect day, in the perfection that the wedding symbolized, that they couldn't see that there, in front of them, was a lesson that could make everyone question their own lives, their own choices, their own values. He, the homeless man, was not the real problem. The real challenge lay in each of those present, trying to deal with the idea that their perfection was about to be interrupted by something they couldn't control or understand. The discomfort was not just his presence, but the confrontation with the truth that life is not controllable and that everyone is susceptible to falling into the abyss of loneliness, error, and loss. That's what he had to offer, a break in the perfect day, an interruption that required people to look inside themselves, to ask themselves, what does love really mean? What does it mean to be surrounded by people, but still feel alone? As he held a microphone and the tension grew, he was about to reveal the biggest secret that no one expected. And what happened next was something that changed everything. The people in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Every glance cast in his direction was heavy with judgment, but also with curiosity. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the faint sound of breathing from everyone present. The bride, still standing with her hands clenched in her white dress, tried not to show her growing anxiety. The groom, his brow furrowed, was about to step forward, perhaps to ask the stranger to leave, but something stopped him. He too felt the weight of tension in the air, but he didn't know how to act. What he didn't know, however, was that this moment, this exchange of glances and silences, was about to turn into something that would transcend any idea of control or perfection. The man, with a serene expression on his face, seemed to be immersed in deep reflection, as if he were tuned into something beyond himself. He didn't look at the groom, nor at the other guests who were murmuring restlessly. He was looking directly at the bride. Her eyes widened when they met his gaze. There was something in his gaze, a depth that made her stop breathing for a second. As if that man, who for a moment she thought was just another homeless man, knew something fundamental about her, something that wasn't visible to the eyes of others, something she herself had never noticed. The feeling of discomfort was replaced by a sense of vulnerability, and her mind started racing. Why was he looking at her like that? And then he began to speak, but his voice, although hoarse and weak, carried an unusual power. It was a voice that didn't demand volume, but attention. He wasn't shouting for help. He wasn't begging for sympathy. He was speaking with a calmness and clarity that seemed to come from experience far greater than anyone in the room could have imagined. "I know what you're thinking," he began, his tone calm but laden with sincerity. "You must be wondering how someone like me, someone with nothing, can be here. And you're probably trying to understand what I'm doing interrupting this very important day. But let me tell you a story." The man paused, looked around the room, and for a moment, seemed to lose himself in his own thoughts. The room, still silent, began to feel a slight discomfort, but now there was something different. They were listening. He didn't have the physique or appearance of a speaker, but somehow he was managing to capture everyone's attention. And with that, the air of judgment that had formed was replaced by genuine attention. It was no longer about the fact that he was a stranger, but about what he might have to say. He had begun to open a gap of curiosity that everyone wanted to fill. Years ago, he continued, I was just like any of you. I had a home, a family, a job. But most importantly, I had dreams. Dreams that seemed immortal, that seemed to guarantee that my life would have some meaning. I thought I was doing well, that my life was on the right track. But I was so focused on moving up, achieving success, conquering more and more, that I began to forget who I really was. I was losing myself. He paused briefly, as if trying to find the right words to convey the depth of what he was trying to share. The once uncomfortable room was now plunged into a deep silence. Even the groom and bride, who had been so tense moments before, seemed unable to look away. In the blink of an eye, he had become the center of every thought in the room. I didn't realize it, but the quest for perfection, for approval, was destroying me from the inside out, he said, and his tone sounded even more serious, as if he were reliving his own memories. I distanced myself from the people who really mattered to me. I stopped being grateful for the little things, the simple things that really make life worth living. And then, one day, everything fell apart. My life turned into chaos, and I found myself with nothing. No home, no family, no purpose. I was lost. And that's when I realized something very important. He looked directly at his fiancée, and his gaze was penetrating. I realized that no matter how much you have, how much you achieve, or how much you try to control, if you don't have what really matters, you've lost everything. Love, connection, gratitude, the little things. These are the things that keep us human. Not material possessions, not titles, not what others think of us. At this point, the room was completely immersed in his story. People were no longer thinking about the fact that he was homeless, but about what he was saying, how he had touched on something so deep, something that everyone had experienced at some point in their lives, but perhaps had never articulated so clearly. He was talking about the losses that no one wanted to face, the wounds that were hidden beneath the surface. He was talking about the fragility of life, about human fallibility, and about how often the unbridled quest for more diverts us from what really matters. The bride, in particular, felt an ache in her chest, as if the weight of his words had hit her heart directly. She looked around and saw the expressions of the other guests, many of them the same as her own, a growing understanding. There was something there that everyone was beginning to understand. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. The man who seemed to be the biggest distraction that day was now teaching everyone about the true value of life, love, and human connections. He was making that wedding, that day of celebration, the moment when everyone would start to see things in a new light. The man, now visibly calmer and more serene, ended his story with one last thought. I don't know why I'm here today. I don't know why I was led to interrupt this moment. But what I do know is that if anything I've said touches the heart of at least one person in this room, then I've already done more than I ever imagined I could. Life is short, and sometimes it's the hardest lessons that teach us what really matters. And with those words, the man left, leaving the room in a reverent silence, now filled with a deeper understanding. The wedding would never be the same, and no one there would be the same after that moment. The man had revealed something crucial, something that would change everyone's perspective on what it really means to live a meaningful life. The impact of the man's words still hung in the air, like a wave that refused to go away. The silence in the room seemed denser now, and no one dared to break it, as if they were all waiting for the exact moment when the story would take its definitive turn. Even the groom, who had previously seemed ready to stop the man, now stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the bride, who, in turn, couldn't look away from anyone but him. Something stirred inside her, a mixture of confusion, compassion, and a pain she couldn't explain. It was as if everything she believed about her own life, about the things that mattered, was being challenged, questioned in a way she wasn't prepared to face. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to react. But as she looked at the man, she felt something deep, something that made her see her own life in a completely new way. He had touched on something she hadn't known was there, something that had been buried under layers of expectations and a path that had already been mapped out. He hadn't just talked about loss or disappointment. He had talked about how life often leads us down paths that make us forget who we really are, what really matters. He had talked about something else, freedom. The freedom to break free from the chains that society imposes on us, from the obligations we take on without really understanding their weight. He had talked about the power of stopping and noticing what is happening around us, of recovering our essence. The groom, still in shock, now looked at the bride. He was beginning to realize that the man's words were not just for her, but for him too, for everyone in the room. He knew that his life up to that point had been built on the incessant pursuit of what he believed was right: success, status, and security. But there, in that instant, with a message the man had left echoing in his mind, he began to question. He thought, is all this really what matters? Or are we just fooling ourselves, chasing a dream that, deep down, isn't ours? The tension in the room was broken by the sound of deep breathing. The man, who until that moment had remained silent, now took a deep breath, preparing to take the final step in his speech. He had shared his pain, his mistakes, his regrets, but now, in an almost surreal way, he was preparing to offer something even more important, a message of hope. His eyes were steady, intense, but no longer filled with suffering. He seemed to have achieved a peace that transcended his condition, a peace he wanted to share. "I am no longer who I was," he said, with a clarity that seemed to surprise even himself. "I'm no longer that lost man, adrift, desperately trying to find some purpose. I'm someone who has learned to look inwards and discover that true strength doesn't come from external achievements. It doesn't come from what others expect of us. True strength comes from knowing who we are, what really drives us, what really matters. And as much as I've lost a lot, there's something that hasn't been taken away from me yet. My ability to learn, to change, to start again." He paused for a long moment, as if absorbing the reactions around him. He felt that the words were being processed, digested, and that something big was happening at that moment. Something he hadn't planned, but which seemed to be unfolding exactly as it should. Something he could no longer ignore. "I'm not perfect," he continued, "but I'm here. And I'm here because, in a moment of total despair, I found what made me want to live again. It wasn't money. It wasn't material goods. It was something much simpler and deeper, the ability to be grateful. The ability to perceive the beauty that exists in every moment, in every small gesture of kindness, in every smile shared." He looked directly at the bride. Her eyes were wet now, and the emotion was visible on her face. "I know today is your day, a day of celebration, and I don't want to steal the show. But if you can take something from me, let me be the reminder that life isn't about accumulating, about conquering, or about impressing. Life is about being genuine, being present, being grateful. Because when you get to the end of it all, that's what you'll have, the moments that were really lived." The bride could no longer hold back her tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion. She felt something she hadn't felt for a long time, a deep connection with the world around her, with the people present, with her own life. She felt that that simple exchange of words, that connection with a man, had changed something inside her, something she could never ignore again. The groom, who had been silent until that moment, now had a contorted face, also touched by the man's words. He didn't know what to say, how to react. He felt a lump in his throat, a sense of unease mixed with gratitude, as if something he had been searching for so long was finally becoming clear to him. Something was being revealed there, in front of everyone, and he knew that his life, like his fiancé's, would never be the same again. Just then, something else happened. The people in the room began to move. Some were drying their eyes. Others were reflecting deeply on the man's words. But contrary to what many might have expected, no one tried to rush things. No one interrupted the silence. The man, with his unexpected wisdom, had triggered something profound in everyone. A silent but overwhelming revolution. And although no one knew what would happen next, everyone knew deep down that this moment would stay with him forever. It was no longer about the wedding, no longer about the party. It was about a revelation, a change in the hearts of everyone there. The man had spoken with a force that no one could ignore, and in doing so, he had awakened something in the hearts of everyone present. The room was fuller now, not of people, but of a new kind of energy. What had begun as a discomfort, an unexpected intrusion, had now become a powerful lesson, a message that no one would ever forget. And without a doubt, from that day on, everyone would be touched by it in ways they never imagined possible. The man, now silent, took one last look at those present. He no longer needed to say anything. He knew that his mission there was accomplished, that the words he had spoken were not just for the groom or the bride, but for everyone there. He was no longer seeing people as just distant figures at a wedding. He saw each of them as a reflection of what he himself had once been, lost, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't his own. But there, at that moment, they all seemed to have been touched by something greater. The groom, who until then had seemed oblivious to what was happening, was now deep in thought. He looked at his fiancée, his eyes shining with a rare intensity. They both knew that something had changed inside them, something that could not be erased. The weight of their lives, of the choices they had made up to that point, seemed to have been softened by the sincerity of those words. The wedding, which until then had seemed to be just a celebratory ceremony, now seemed to be a new beginning, an opportunity to build something truer, more in line with what they really wanted and not what the world expected of them. The guests, for the most part, were speechless, touched by the message. The sound of the party, which had previously been marked by laughter and rapid conversations, now seemed distant. The man's words had touched each of us in a silent but powerful way. That moment, although fleeting, would remain etched in everyone's memory because, somehow, everyone had been challenged to rethink their lives. What had seemed like a simple intrusion, an uncomfortable interruption, had become the key to something greater, a reminder that true happiness and purpose lie not in social conventions or the expectations of others, but in the ability to be genuine, to be grateful, to recognize the value of what really matters. And so the wedding went ahead, but no one there would leave the same way. The man was no longer a simple street dweller. He was a messenger, someone who, with a simple gesture, had transformed a day of celebration into a moment of deep reflection and change. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.